Good morning and welcome to my weekly video series. If you've been with me in my previous videos, you'll know that we are going through a series of Heilkunst philosophical topics and taking them into, I should say, taking them out of the specific clinical setting and bringing them into everyday life, and how these philosophies and these concepts are useful to living a better life every day. So today's topic is how Heilkunst philosophy protects you from zombies. So I'm just to say up front, it sounds like I'm being cute and I'm using that as some kind of analogy, but actually I mean that in a very real way. I'm considering zombies to be real, and as you see from my title, I'm talking about philosophical zombies, or in other words, concepts which are part of a whole allopathic worldview, or really what amounts to being a dead worldview. So we're going to get into the details of that in just a moment. But on that point that I just said, once you really start to understand allopathic medicine, and not only medicine, but the whole allopathic philosophy, you come to realize that it is premised on what is really a dead philosophy, a view of the world, a view of life, which is based on death rather than based on things that are alive, such as human beings. Look, you and me, we're talking here, we're an example of life. But to get into a little bit into the content, oops, let me bring up my screen here. Yeah, there we go. So, excuse me, just half a second. I'm having a minor little tech problem here. Okay, perfect. So I got this working. So as I'm saying, we're looking at the allopathic worldview, as I just said, is premised on death. And a great example of that, if you even look at this, I think this is, in a sense, symbolic in a way, but it's a very real example. When an allopathic doctor studies, when they go to med school, we all know this, they study cadavers or dead bodies instead of living function. They'll dissect the body. Now that may be one good way of learning anatomy, where all the parts are and everything, but this is really a study of death. This is a study of things in their kind of final form, or their unchanging, unmoving form. So this is kind of what I mean by a zombie. This is kind of what I mean by this philosophy of death. So allopathic medicine, as I said, is not just the I'm sorry, the word allopathy is not just applied to the word medicine, allopathic medicine, but really we have this much broader understanding of the entire modern worldview, or modern philosophy is very much an allopathic philosophy. So all of what I will say today, it'll have some of it a very specific medical basis, but you will see quickly this has a much broader application to the allopathic philosophy as a whole. So the zombies everywhere philosophy is maybe what we can call it. So there's going to be 3 philosophical zombies that we look at today, and well, let's just go through them. So number 1 is what I call the zombie of materialism. So starting with the allopathic medicine view, but again, this is more widespread than medicine. The allopathic view is that the only thing, the only valid object of medicine, of study and of observation, of treatment, is the material body. So, we've talked about this, actually, I guess it was last week's video, we were talking about that worldview of materialism. Here it is again. We're resurrecting this one for today's video. And the material body, as it's, as we look at it in our broader Heilkunst understanding, our living understanding of what health is and what life is and everything, it's not only it's not the only real thing. The material body is, as I say here on my note, it's actually, left to its own devices, it's actually just a corpse. I sometimes, in my very black humor kind of way, I'll say to a patient, or just in general life conversation, I'll say that our physical body, or our material body, is it's kind of like it's our corpse. It's what's going to be the star of our funeral one day, and it's what we're carrying around with us our whole life. So that's a little bit morbid or a little bit of black humor, but it's kind of true. We are a walking corpse in that sense of if you only consider the material body, that's all you got. You're just looking at the corpse of the person. But in the true dynamic sense, once you understand the full functioning of health and the body, the living body and everything, it's not just, we aren't just our material body, but we have a material body to help us fulfill the purposes, the higher purposes of our life or of our existence. So Hahnemann, we'll actually talk about this in a separate video, but if you study Hahnemann and his organon in aphorisms 9 and 10, I don't have those right here at my fingertips, but basically, it's a very rich few sentences that he lays down there. He's kind of saying things along the lines I'm saying, that we're not just that material body, but it's something that when it's functioning properly, it is there for us to use to unfold our higher purposes. So again, in this zombie number one of materialism, in healthcare, you just get this material body, but as I say, that's a zombie, that's a corpse, that is not giving us this fuller understanding of life and living function and all of those kinds of things. So to further that, if we go into the allopathic definition of health, this stems off of this idea of just a material view of life. By consequence of that, the definition of health in allopathy simply becomes a lack of symptoms. Somebody who doesn't have any symptoms is defined as healthy in that system. The other way we can extend that is the consequence of that definition of health as a lack of symptoms, meaning the whole goal of treatment in allopathic medicine is to get rid of symptoms, right? If you have somebody has, well, this is, if you look at the whole scope of allopathic medicine, there's antibiotics and antidepressants, anti this, anti that. It's all about getting rid of those symptoms. But once we understand this bigger definition of life, the bigger definition of health, we realize that, that's part of this zombie number one. That's just moving things around in the material body, but we cannot qualify that as a definition of health. And as I mentioned with Hahnemann, in a future video, when we go deeper into his aphorisms, especially 9 and 10, and his concept of health, we get this idea of a higher purpose, and life is unfolding within that higher purpose. So again, within this zombie number one of materialism, we have kind of a false definition of life, a false definition of health, all pinned on this material definition. We did talk more about this last week, if you saw that video, or you can go back and watch that. But this idea of materialism is what we're calling our zombie number one today. So zombie number two, and we also have talked about this in other ways in previous videos, but it's what I call the onlooker consciousness. Actually, I didn't invent that term. That comes from Owen Barfield, who was kind of a 20th century interpreter of Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, and he went into some really interesting philosophical work, around a lot of these points. But what he called the onlooker consciousness is, let's get a little more specific. What we've been talking about in some of the recent videos is this kind of false philosophical premise of subject-object dualism. As I say, as I've said in earlier videos, that simply says it's a world that's made of two kind of very different realms. The one realm is the inner subjective realm. Here I'm aware of my own inner subjectivity, my experiences, my sensations, all the things that are going on inside my skin, as it were, inside my skull, in this view. And the counterpart to that is the objective world out there, the rocks and the trees and the dogs walking around and the cars driving along the road. All that is the supposed objective world. And then somehow, my subject in here and all the objects out there are somehow meeting, but philosophy always stumbles and never quite gives us the final answer of how that's supposed to happen. But anyways, we've talked about that in a previous video. But for our purposes today, I'm calling this our second zombie, the onlooker consciousness. And it's a zombie because it's really part of this broader allopathic worldview of death, right? In this kind of subject-object consciousness, there's no life in our consciousness. There's no life in our, in our participating of the world. But it's, as I say, it puts us into this very dead inner subjectivity. It cannot make contact with reality. It cannot make contact with the world. So the final note I have about that is when we get more into what we've called in recent videos living thinking, or what we could call here dynamic consciousness, that's where the human being gets, I should say the human consciousness, the human being activating their consciousness and mixing their consciousness with the world, participating in the world, adding thoughts, adding living thinking, all these things we've been talking about. This is what what takes, rather than a dead subjectivity on the one hand and a dead objectivity in the world out there, it's all dead in that worldview. We get this higher function of human consciousness, which really fully enlivens the world. It's what brings, whatever it is that the world is and all that we experience, that living consciousness, that higher function of human consciousness really brings the whole world up to its highest expression, its highest meaning. So in that sense, we, not to make humans egotistical about this, but this is just a very true function of consciousness, that this very living function of human consciousness is what fulfills the world, or what brings it to its highest expression. Or it's, that old cliche, or that expression, within a couple or whatever, where they may say to each other, I complete you, we complete each other. It's that romantic idea that, the single person is not really complete without their other half, or their better half, kind of bringing them to life, bringing all that they are fully out into the world, out into the relationship and the world at large. So that's our second zombie, is that onlooker consciousness. And our final zombie this morning, zombie number 3, come out from curtain number 3. These are what I'm calling lifeless abstractions. So we hinted at this a moment ago, but let's go a little bit more into this. So out of that onlooker consciousness, which I was just talking about, which is seen as a subjective phenomena, the idea within that is that subject cannot and is not connected to reality. They are just kind of lost in their own abstract subjectivity. It's I guess a way to say that it's as if everyone walking around in this worldview, it's supposed that we're all just walking around in our own little personal movie theater. We're our own subjectivity, our own abstractions. These are presumed in our zombie number 3, the lifeless abstractions, that these abstractions, our subjectivity, is not real. And on the basis of what I'm saying today, this is another form of zombie. This is another form of a presumption of something dead that is supposedly all that there is. There's just dead abstraction, dead subjectivity. None of this has life in it once you really dig into the philosophy of all that. And in my last note here, what I say, instead of dead abstractions, by getting into our living thinking or our dynamic consciousness, we actually penetrate into reality, seeing it in its full living or dynamic activities. And just a little bit of a hint or a clue around that word, to penetrate. Of course, that's a very sexual word, and what has more life than sexual functions, right? That penetrating function, that sexual function. Again, in terms of our philosophical consciousness, that's a very real dynamic part of being alive and being in that dynamic consciousness. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. We have our 3 zombies. Maybe we can name them. I didn't think of naming them. I gave them their philosophical names, but maybe they need cute names like, well, let's call them Larry, Curly and Mo just for fun, but we'll stick with their philosophical. When we're having our philosophical conversations, we'll call them by their proper names, but of course we can have fun with them too. We can start to play with these zombies and have fun with them. So that's our topic for today. As I said, it brings back a lot of the threads from some of our previous videos. Please go back and review those, to tie all the threads together for what we're talking about today. But stay tuned. There will be more videos coming in this series, wherever you're watching this today, Facebook, YouTube, some of the other platforms. Just stay tuned to that channel, and my next videos will be coming your way very soon. So thanks again for joining me, and we will see you soon.